you have to be fasting and you have to be doing bulletproof coffee and you have to have bacon every single day. And
Hello everyone and welcome to Carnivore Done Right. Today's guest is Irvin. Chris is a nutrition science researcher and a writer with an expertise in ketogenic dieting. Now, Chris holds a master's degree in exercise and nutrition science and spends his time in a graduate school studying the ketogenic diet for performance and therapeutic applications. Now, Chris is the education manager of Perfect Keto and strives to make the ketogenic diet easy and keto science accessible to everyone. So this is what I want to actually start. So this is one of my favorite topics. You have a really interesting background, Chris. So tell me, how does the ketogenic dieting work?
yeah, so it's magic, right? It's like the wonder diet that you can follow and cure any illness with it, right? No, so yeah, well, I always laugh about that because I feel like that's the typical way people think about keto. It's become this four-letter word that either is a miracle and saves lives, or it's the thing that kills you, and nobody really understands what it actually is.
Yeah, no kidding.
But in summary, yeah, keto it's a low-carb diet, and I think that traditionally we have a way that we look at keto, but I think that a right way to look at keto is it's a low-carb diet that allows your body to get into a state of ketosis, which it means that you are burning fat. And your liver is producing ketones, and your brain is using those ketones for fuel. And because of the physiology that happens in your body when you're doing that, you can experience a lot of health benefits from it. When I talk about how the ketogenic diet works, it's a little bit different, I think, from most people. Most people think that it's, you have to be fasting and you have to be doing bulletproof coffee and you have to have bacon every single day. And really, the way I look at it is it's a whole food diet. You eat real food. You keep your carbs low, and then you make sure that you're getting enough protein and fat to kind of meet your goals.
Okay, so going into this a little bit more in details, is there a specific ratio you recommend for fat to protein?
Yeah, so I think that it really depends on your goal. So traditionally, I mean, when I first started studying keto in grad school, this was about 5 years ago, it was the story was 20 to 25% of your calories coming from protein, 70 to 75% coming from fat, and like 5% from carbs. And I think that this is this kind of puts the diet in a box. I think that like that can be a good approach for certain uses.
Okay.
I think that the traditional higher fat ratio of ketogenic dieting, the higher fat to protein ratio, that was developed for epilepsy, which I think is a much different cause or a much different reason why many of us are following it. So I always say that it depends on your goals. I mean, there was a study that came out end of last year where the 20% protein model led to muscle loss in men who were resistance training, right? So I think that's kind of tells you that if you're exercising and trying to put on muscle, then you probably need to change that ratio up and increase your protein. So it definitely depends on the goal.
Okay, no, that's awesome. Thanks so much for explaining that, and I'm hoping the audience can actually capture quite a bit of that information because I got that question on an ongoing basis. I know right now we're doing the carnivore diet, but we still have a high amount of audience where they are on a ketogenic and they feel lost when they're doing resistance training because they still kind of up in the fat of 70% and reducing the protein so low that they kind of feel they're losing muscle mass more than anything.
Yeah, and you're just not recovering very well either. I mean, if you're putting yourself, if you're training appropriately, you should be training that you're in a way that you're putting stress on your body, and then you recovering from that stress is really important. And fat definitely provides a lot of nutrients that you need for recovery, but protein is really important too. And I think that this narrative about how protein needs to be restricted, I think that may have some validity for certain uses of the diet, but I think for the majority of us who are trying to lose weight and just get healthier, yes, I think that you definitely need to be having a lot more protein.
Okay, no, perfect. So when does the ketogenic becomes unhealthy?
It's a tough question to ask because I'm kind of in a position where I'm pretty particular about it, right? Like I follow a certain keto diet that I think is like the most optimal. And what that is I buy whole foods that come from They're locally sourced, so I get all my foods from farmers markets where I can, talk to the ranchers about how they're raising the meat and how the eggs are, how the chickens are being fed. And
Hmm.
if I'm eating plants, sometimes I'm carnivore, sometimes I'm not. When I'm actually eating plants, I make sure I know where those are coming from. That's the diet that I follow. But I have a belief that I don't think that the traditional keto diet that people are following now, where it's like processed dairy, pork rinds, things that you may call like a dirty keto diet. I
Yes.
don't think that that's necessarily the best approach, but the caveat to that is that I think it's a very, very great alternative to the standard American diet. So if
Hmm.
you were before you were eating McDonald's every single day, and now you're eating McDonald's without the bun, I do think you're making a massive improvement in your health, especially with the way that we live in a society that's a lot of pre-diabetic and diabetic.
Hmm.
So I think that dirty version of keto where you're having a lot of more like processed keto friendly foods, I don't think that it's the most optimal, but I think that can be a really great starting point for people who are, coming from that standard American diet.
Okay, no, makes sense. So usually we do get a lot of audience where, you know, like you said, it's better to actually eat, the burger, the bacon without the bun, which is it's a great start. Still, it is a dirty keto, but at least they're actually doing some type of improvement, which is really good. And possibly down the road, when they start to feel a little bit more active, a little bit better cognition, their gut is actually healing. Okay, let's take it one step further. Let's start to kind of eliminate some of the processed food. Let's start to kind of eliminate some of the cured with nitrates and other ingredients that is actually infused with a lot of the pork or cured meat or imported meats as well, even cheeses as well too. Just because there's still a number of population out there that actually aren't able to digest certain foods, right? So.
Yeah. And it's like, your health is a journey,
Hmm.
and it's not, your health isn't a 30-day diet fix. It's not a hop on this program and follow it for a while, yo-yo dieting. So if you look at your health as a journey, that means that you have the rest of your life, right? That the goals, you're trying to live longer and you're trying to have the quality years in that time. And for somebody who, like I said, if you're following that standard American diet, and you are able to, like, you cut out the bun, you cut out the fried foods, you cut out, but maybe you replace it with a lot of these, keto friendly
Yeah.
foods that are alternatives to that. That's such a great place to start. And to your point, you're going to start feeling the benefits of that, which for some people, this is going to be the first time they ever realize that diet can impact the way you feel. I mean, most of us are operating at a baseline
Hmm.
that is it's a baseline where we feel like crap. We have bad energy. Our mood is impaired. We're not happy with the way that we look. So, that becomes our baseline. That's just how we think that life is. And then when you follow this, even this dirty version of keto, it's such a drastic improvement because of what it's not, that you feel better. And then when you feel better, that can be the proof of concept that you can use to say, okay, now I'm going to take it a step further and try to eat, more whole foods, organic foods, grass-fed meats, things like that. But for anybody who doesn't believe that nutrition is a big lever that they can pull, we can't assume that they're going to jump right to this most optimized version of keto. You have to kind of meet them where they're at and see what works best for them.
Oh no, for sure, 100%. Now, we have a lot of people that they actually, when we talk about carbohydrates, they look at carbohydrates as being a poison sometimes. Now, how many carbs is required per day? Like, what is safe to stay in ketosis and what isn't to you?
Yeah, so I think that it really, again, that's super specific and individualized. I think that a general rule of thumb is that if you can keep them below 30, for some people, maybe below 20, and in my opinion, that's total carbs. I think
Okay.
that for 95% of the people out there, that will work. But really, it comes down to what's your metabolism like?
Yeah.
For somebody who's like, I'm somebody who, I play basketball 3 times a week. I resistance train 3 or 4 times a week. I've been an athlete most of my life, so I have a pretty healthy metabolism. I've never been overweight or anything, so I can actually eat, probably 80 to 100 grams of carbs and stay in ketosis. And then you
Okay.
have some of those freak people out there who can have 200 grams and stay in ketosis. So it really does depend, I think, on how healthy you are. But for most people, like if you're turning to the ketogenic diet for weight loss, chances are your number is going to be below 30. So I think that that's kind of a safe rule of thumb.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Now, we have I know we discussed this earlier about, ketogenic and bulletproof coffee, and everybody's putting MCT and butter. What's your thoughts on MCT oil as an additional, let's say, ketone booster being on a ketogenic?
Yeah, so I like to use it, but I like to use it strategically. So I think that a lot of people are dousing everything in MCT oil, and they think that like it's synonymous with keto. So it's just like you have to eat bacon to be keto, you have
Yeah.
to drink MCTs to be keto. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I view MCTs as a supplement. So whenever you consider a supplement, I think if you should, when you're deciding if you should take a supplement, you have to think about, does it help me achieve a goal that I'm going for, or does it fill a gap in my diet? And if you're somebody who's not getting enough fat in your diet, MCTs can be a really great way to get more fat in your diet.
Hmm.
But if you're somebody who is struggling to get your ketone levels elevated, or you have a goal that would benefit from higher ketone levels, then I think MCTs are great. So for me, I use MCTs. I use a C8 MCT oil in the morning, doing kind of a fat fast.
Okay.
And the purpose of that for me is that I want my brain to work better because I'm working at that time of the morning. I'm usually writing and researching. So that's kind of my purpose for it. So I always kind of say that, you really have to figure out, like, again, what your goal is. If you're just dousing everything in MCT oil because you think you heard it was good for you, that's probably not the best approach. But I think it's a really, I mean, it's one of the only fats we can eat that will increase our ketone levels. So it's if you need to increase your ketone levels, or you need that boost in energy, they can be a great source for that.
Okay. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. What's your thoughts on, like, taking MCT oil, but there's still some type of carbohydrates been introduced? Do you believe that the glucose and the MCT will actually, for the uptake to the mitochondria, do you think that will actually conflict at all, or?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, you hear a lot of people say how you shouldn't really, and in general, you shouldn't do like fat and carbs together. In terms of like how it would operate in the mitochondria, my assumption is that glucose would be chosen first,
Of course.
except for brain cells. So we do know that brain cells will preferentially take up ketones even in the presence of glucose.
Okay.
That's something that we found in research. But I think for the rest of the body, you're probably going to see glucose being taken up. And one of the reasons why that is because most of our cells outside of our brain will not use ketones when they're present to preserve them for the brain,
Hmm.
because the brain can't use fat. It can only use glucose and ketones. So a lot of times the rest of the cells will use another fuel source before going to those ketones. So I think that for, if you're talking about like, your cells that are related to like exercise and things like that, cells outside the brain, I think glucose would probably be used first in that case.
Okay, perfect. Now, there are lots of keto supplements. Do you think, are they safe? Should the audience invest in them? Are they worth it? Or is it just a waste of money?
When you say keto supplements, do you mean exogenous ketones?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. So well, anybody who knows my background is going to think that I'm a little biased because I work for Perfect Keto, and they were one of the first companies to make exogenous ketones. But I actually was studying with exogenous ketones back in grad school before there were any products available on the market. So
Okay.
we used to take the raw salts, we'd mix them into water with like a Mio, and it tasted horrible. It was like the worst experiments ever to do. But so I've seen, before the industry was developed for them, I've seen the benefits of them. I'm a firm believer of them. I think that we definitely lack a lot of human data for the different uses of it. I think that hopefully that's coming, but we do know mechanistically we see a lot of ways in which these exogenous ketones can be beneficial. I think that the problem, though, is that they're marketed incorrectly. I think that a
Okay.
lot of people market them as a replacement to the diet. I think that they're best used in conjunction with the diet. And I think that, it's similar to MCT oils, where it's like, what are the cases where having elevated ketone levels is beneficial? When you take an exogenous ketone product, you see an increase in ketones for 2 to 3 hours typically,
Hmm.
with the salts, that is.
Yes.
Now, if your goal is to improve your brain function, pretty great. If you say you're working on a project, or my favorite time to take it is like, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't want to drink caffeine, but I need a little bit more energy. I'll turn to ketones. But then you think about the therapeutic side of things, they're shown to help modulate like the inflammatory response, the immune response. And then, having elevated ketones can be helpful with like cancer treatment and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of uses of them, and they're a great complement to the diet, but not an alternative to the diet.
Okay, now I have a question in regards to the ketones and stuff, the ketone levels when it comes down to cancer. Now, there's different forms of cancer, and from my research, I did hear that certain cancers, they do actually thrive on a high ketogenic or a high fat diet. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so well, I'll preface it by saying I'm not an expert in this area, but I have studied it a fair amount because I'm pretty passionate about the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I've come across and what I've seen, I think that the standard ketogenic diet and elevated ketones is extremely effective for brain cancers.
Okay.
I think that it really, really makes sense for brain cancers. I think that the evidence becomes less clear when you get to other forms of cancer, where you see varied results on whether or not it works. And I think the important thing to remember is that cancer cells are very intuitive, and they will take in almost anything that's available to them to use it. So, even fat can be used as a cancer cell to improve like the integrity of the cell. It can be used to make the cell stronger so that it's like less susceptible to immune destruction or different like treatments like radiation and chemo. So now with a brain cancer, you don't have to worry about that because fat doesn't really cross the blood-brain barrier. But for cancers outside of the brain, potentially a concern. And I know there was a paper that just recently got published that was talking about some different cancer cell types that can also use ketones for energy. And if you talk to some of the traditional low carb cancer researchers, that's kind of something that was never believed to be true. We didn't think that they could. We thought that most of cancer cells had damaged metabolisms that would prevent them from doing it. But I think what we see is that cancer cells are very intuitive and they can adapt, and they can really use a lot of different fuel sources. Okay. But what I would say as a caveat to that is that even if they're able to use ketones, what's the trade-off, right? Like if they're using ketones instead of glucose, I would have to imagine that the outcome is going to be a lot better for them, especially with the way that we know glucose is like fuel to the fire for a cancer cell. So, I don't know the degree in which these cells are metabolizing or using these ketones.
For sure.
But I have to think that it's better than the alternative.
Okay. No, makes sense. Sounds good. Now, coming down to our last question, this one usually actually always comes from our audience. Do you think that we need electrolytes supplementation being on a keto diet, especially if certain individuals tend not to consume as much carbohydrates, such as like we're talking about greens or vegetables?
Yeah, so I do think so. I think the supplement, like when I talk about keto supplements or supplements to take on the diet, I think electrolytes are the one that's universal. I think that everybody should be on it. I know like the question that people usually have is like, okay, from a ancestral standpoint, why didn't they have to have electrolytes? It's like, well, their diet looked a lot different, right? And like when the hunter-gatherers were killing animals, they were probably drinking some of the blood that was really rich in electrolytes. That's a lot different from the food that we're eating today. Mm-hmm. And when you go on a low-carb diet, when insulin levels lower, you lose more water, and that means electrolyte imbalances and deficiencies. So, all of those symptoms that you hear people talk about, the headache, brain fog, muscle cramps, muscle fatigue, or impaired training, things like that, most of those are a result of electrolyte deficiencies. Okay. And I think that the majority of people, especially if you're in that super low carb where you're, maybe you're going full blown carnivore, you're not having any greens or anything like that, you're probably even going to be more susceptible to that. So I think that those are a pretty key supplement. And I would say too, if you're an exerciser, I think that it's even more important, because if you are doing stuff that's like increasing your sweat rate, that's just kind of, again, another thing. So like if you're somebody who's getting in the gym several times a week, it just makes sense to add that supplement. Okay.
No, makes sense. Now, I know there's a lot of influencers out there. They always talk about taking additional potassium and sometimes, reaching 4,000 milligrams or 6,000 milligrams a day. Do you think that actually, do we actually require that much being on a ketogenic?
No, I don't think we require that much. And it's really hard when you actually look at the research. So about a year ago, I went through and I was like, I'm going to fully dive into electrolytes and just try to really understand, because a common question I would get is how much do you need of each? Mm-hmm. And when you start looking at the research, you realize that if anybody's giving you a specific recommendation of how much you need, they're kind of full of it. because the body's so dynamic and each one plays a role with the other. Like how much sodium you have is going to play a role in your potassium absorption and stuff like that. So it's really hard to say. Now, one thing I'll say is that it seems like for people who are healthy, who have proper kidney function, you don't have to worry about having too much. Most of the electrolytes you'll just excrete through your urine, so you don't really have to worry about going too overboard. Now, obviously, potassium is one that there is a threshold because there is an amount you can have that can be extremely toxic, but it's really hard to reach that, I think, unless you're intentionally going for that. So I don't think that that amount that you're saying for potassium is probably necessary for most people. I think that what's more important is getting a solid ratio of all of them, and then kind of adjusting that ratio based on how you're feeling is, I think, the best approach.
Awesome. Hey, you really appreciate all that info. It's just amazing. I think our audience will definitely love your knowledge, your background as well too. Chris, that was amazing. Thanks so much, my friend, and hopefully we can do another episode a little bit more in depth when you have time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you.